Going to be the new intro, this. Mike's in the way. Can't do me welcome. Look. There you go. Now that important business is over and done with. One more thing that regular, if you one or two in the world viewers of this channel, is that I've removed that banner from the overlay with each lesson on. It's a bit of a pain to keep updating everyone, so I'm going to sack it off. I will just introduce what lessons we're going to be talking about today. In these lessons, I'm going to be covering problem, not reusable, lesson 5, props part 1 and props part 2. So without further ado, let's get right on with the action. So take it away, Bob. Bob's going to be explaining the problem with what we've been doing so far in these lessons, and that is, what's the point in using React, which is what I'm looking forward to finding out. So away we go. Double click that, and I will click that, and you'll hear Bob, hopefully.
I assume many of you watching the last screencast were thinking to yourselves, okay, I'm creating this card component, but because I'm hard coding the data in, it's not going to be reusable. I've updated the Google slide to show you maybe a more realistic version of the design that we're looking for, because we're not just going to have the same experience with all of the same data inside. These kinds of repeated components are found everywhere online, and if you just start looking for them, you will see them everywhere. I pulled up screenshots from some of the first designs I could think of. In Amazon, every component or every product is going to have a repeated element. Here's IMDb that has something that looks relatively similar to what we're doing. And here's Apple, which has different product components, which really just have an image and a title, image, title, image, title. And you can imagine that when a new movie comes out to put on IMDb, there isn't a developer out there that is actually typing in new HTML or copy and pasting the HTML that they already created and then just changing out some of the data. But instead, these components are actually data-driven. On IMDb, for example, all they need to do is add a new movie to their database, which includes things like the cover image, the rating, the title, and so forth, and then the website will automatically update to include a new movie in its list here. We're going to cover the data aspect later, but for now, the main problem we have is that our component is so hard-coded that we can't really reuse it in any meaningful way. And in React, this is where the concept of props comes into play. Now, in my years of teaching React, I have found that props can be one of the more difficult subjects for students to grasp. And so what I plan on doing is taking the topic and just spreading it a little bit thin over a few different screencasts, and you'll get your hands on the keyboard and get to really practice with it so that you can understand the concept of props. So let's jump right in and get started.
Yes, let's. No pause in the vid. Let's get going. I think I watched a bit before. Cheated. You caught me.
By understanding the basic concept of props in React. What you see here is just a plain index.html file. We haven't introduced anything dealing with React in this. I want you to take a close look at the elements that you see here and see if you can figure out what's wrong with them. Let's start with the anchor tag. An A tag, an anchor tag, is intended to link you to another place, but currently we don't have an attribute like the href specified. Without an href, this link is essentially useless. We need the href property in order for us to send someone to another page, maybe like google.com. Similarly, the image element is basically useless without any kind of source property. We need to add this source attribute or property in order to specify exactly what image will be here. We could put the path to a local file, or we could put the address of a file that's hosted somewhere on the internet. Input is interesting because I think on its own, it actually will put an input box that we could type into if we wanted to. However, there are attributes or properties that we can add to the input that will make it a lot more, let's say, beefed up or capable. For example, I can add a placeholder that says something like first name, and that suddenly makes the first name text appear inside of my element on the page. Or there's ones that have even more consequence to them, like the type property. If I change the type of this input to something totally different, like submit, now it changes from an input text box to a button. Similarly, I could change it to radio, and it completely changes the visual look of this input. These are concepts that I'm sure you're already very familiar with. Let's look at a similar parallel example in JavaScript. Here I've written a function that's called add two numbers together, and it just hard returns 1 and 2. Think for a second, what is wrong with this function? It's syntactically correct, but what's wrong with a function like this?
Got no
Well,
parameters.
it's very, very limited in its capabilities. Right now, if I call add two numbers together, it will always return 3. Essentially, it's a useless function. Now, you might already see where I'm going with this. If I add some parameters, like let's say a and b, to this function, now I can dynamically add and return the result, or rather the sum, of the two numbers that I pass in. And with the small addition of these two parameters that I've added, I now have sort of beefed up this function in a way that it's capable of adding whatever two numbers I want, not just the hard-coded 1 and 2 that used to be there. Again, these concepts should be familiar to you by now, but this is just a primer for us to understand the concept of props in React. In both of these instances, in JavaScript and HTML, we can see that passing additional information to our maybe elements, or in this case, functions, allows us to reuse these elements or functions in multiple different ways. So with that primer under our belts, let's look at another conceptual parallel that is a little more visual.
Conceptual parallel. That's a new one on me. Get ready for a conceptual parallel. Can't even say it. I guess what he was saying in that previous lesson was React will make things not hard-coded. Oh, Brightside. My son watches that. It's pretty good. It's pretty cool, Brightside.
Let's try to understand props with a little bit more of a visual example. This is a screenshot taken from YouTube, and as you spend more and more time with a framework like React, you will begin to see these patterns of elements on the page that are repeated pretty much everywhere on the internet. For example, if you look here, you'll see that there are multiple components being displayed here, but all of them have essentially the exact same structure. They each have an image toward the top that takes up about half of the height of the component. Each of them has bolded text that represents the title. There's the view count showing the number of days ago that it was published. There's even little timestamps embedded inside of the image in the lower right. And as I've mentioned before, there certainly isn't a developer at YouTube that every single time a video is posted to YouTube, they go in, copy the code from an old tile, and paste it in again so that it can exist on the site. Instead, a developer has created a single component, maybe let's call it a video tile component, and has made that component flexible enough to take in as a property the image and the title, the view count, the number of days ago it was posted, who posted it, the timestamp, and so forth. And as you become more experienced in React and you start to see these patterns for yourself, you'll begin to realize that they can be nested inside of each other. For example, not only do we have repeated video tile elements here, but we have something that let's suppose is called a video list. Each one of these is made up as a parent-child relationship of video tiles. Even small things like on the left side of the page, you can see that these are probably individual components that are taking in properties to help them display something slightly different. In this case, it's probably just two elements. There's an image and there's some text. So that's probably enough of the conceptual. I think you're starting to understand the concept. Now let's go back to React and we'll start looking at how this is actually applied in code.
Okay, so this is lesson... I wasn't going to cover this, but might as well. Let's keep trucking. Keep on trucking, I think as they say in the USNA. Lesson 8, aside JS. This is an aside from Bob's perspective, I guess. JS inside JSX, so JavaScript inside JSX. Right, okay, so let's watch this.
Before we can continue on with props, we need to take a quick aside to talk about something. We've learned how our components will be returning JSX, which is a special syntax of JavaScript, or rather, it's something that's created by React and allows us to write our React code in a very declarative way. However, one of the most common things that you'll find yourself doing is trying to insert values from JavaScript inside of your JSX. Right now, we just have some text inside of our H1, but let's assume we had a value like first name. Maybe this is Joe, and a last name. Let's say Schmo. Think for a second, how would you change our H1 to no longer say hello world, but instead to say hello Joe Schmo?
Well, you'd reference the variable there, and you right. Well, you'd print the first variable there and the second variable there, I guess. Fairly straightforward. reference the variable rather.
Well, we can probably see ahead of time that just trying to input first name, last name, or maybe even adding a space in there as if this were regular JavaScript isn't really going to work. If I do this, I'm going to get the literal text of first name plus last name interpreted as the text content of my H1. Fortunately, React has made it really simple to interpret something as JavaScript instead of text when it's inside of a JSX element. And that is by simply surrounding it with a single set of curly braces, almost like it were an object. So at this point, before I even hit save, I'm going to give you a quick challenge. Simply enough, I want you to finish off the H1 that we have here so that it says, hello, Joe Schmo. And actually, let's put an exclamation point in there for good measure. Pause the screencast and do this challenge.
A piece of piss. Template strings. Do then, is it dollar? Strings in JavaScript. You'd have to do all the adding and all that. No, you can't. Just create a string there, isn't it? So do that. Yes, it's kind of like is a template string. Yep, fine. That's pretty good. Don't need template strings in React.
Well, if I hit save, we'll see that it interprets the Joe correctly. Instead of saying first name, it's now taking the value of our first name JavaScript
Oops.
variable and inserting it here. And then, of course, the rest of this text is still there. If I were just to surround last name, then I would get a little bit closer, but I still have my plus and my quotation marks. So at this point, I can just get rid of those, put a space in between my two values, hit save, and there we go. Hello, Joe Schmo. The way I like to think of this is that as soon as I start seeing JSX, the interpreter sort of goes into JSX mode. Anything after this greater than symbol is going to start being considered the text content, or in the case of having nested elements, other JSX elements, and we're currently in what you could call JSX land. However, as soon as we see this opening curly brace, we switch back into our JavaScript mode or JavaScript land. And then anything inside of my set of curly braces will be considered JavaScript. Once I get to this closing curly brace, I'm now back into JSX, which is why I have an actual space in the text between my first name and my last name. Then it sees my curly brace again, so I'm back in JavaScript land. The closing curly brace tells me I'm done with JavaScript. I get the exclamation point as part of my actual text. And then I close off my JSX tag. Now, once I enter JavaScript land, I can actually do more than just take in values from my JavaScript up above. In fact, anything that I put inside of my curly braces can be run as JavaScript code. Let me clean up this challenge really quick. Something that's important to note is that anything I put inside of my curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript code. So I'm not limited to just pulling in values like this. For example, I could do something like, say, I have a new date, which is a new date object, and then change this to something like it is currently about, and then run some JavaScript code inside of my curly braces saying date.getHours. And then let's say we want to do a modulo 12 so that we get the AM PM hours, or rather like on a 12-hour clock. I hit save, and there we go. It's currently about 3. Maybe I say o'clock. And that's because for me, when I'm recording this, it's currently 3:21 p.m. And in fact, I wouldn't even necessarily need to create my date outside of here. I could say new date.getHours, and I'm going to get the same result, even without doing it out here, because anything that I put inside these curly braces will be run as regular JavaScript. Now, personally, I think it's a lot more readable to do the actual JavaScript outside of my return value in my JSX. So if I were doing this in the real world, I'd probably say something like const hours equals date.getHours modulo 12, and then inside of my render down here, all I'm doing is putting hours. And of course, we get the same result that way. One thing that's nice about doing it this way is you can sort of separate the logic that your component is running with the display that your component needs to show on the screen. So for example, let's say I wanted to say, depending on the time of day, good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Well, I could do all of my logic up here to determine what should display after the word good. For example, I want it to say good afternoon because for me right now it's afternoon. I could do something like this, and I'll probably speed this up so it doesn't take up too much time. All I've done really is created a changeable variable, let time of day, and then said if the current hours is less than 12, it's morning. If it's between 12 and 17, then it's afternoon, and otherwise it's considered night. I probably should make something for evening because 5 o'clock p.m. seems a little bit early to say to someone, but whatever. So here's another mini challenge for you. Okay, your challenge is simply
pause then.
To fix the H1 below to use the time of day string that we determined in the code above. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge.
Okay. Up a bit. So time of day is hard coded there. We don't want that, do we, Bob? We want to use this, the value that's in this variable, time of day. If you see it's been set in this if statement, so the logic's saying if the time's less than 12 p.m. it's the morning, it's the afternoon, and so on. So yeah, so based on what he's just said, curly braces he called them. I call them curly brackets. So we just reference the time of day variable, I guess. Bang it in, that should work. Save. Yep. Yeah, pretty straightforward. I quite like the fact that you can do all your JavaScript above the return, and as Bob says, keeps that all nice and tidy in there. That's pretty cool. You can do that. It kind of makes JavaScript really, not really easy, but easier.
Simply enough, all we really need to do is remove the hard-coded afternoon, put a set of curly braces, and then say time of day. Now, of course, because it is afternoon for me, this will still say afternoon. I suppose I could just trick this. Maybe I change this to say if it's between 12 and 1, then we consider it afternoon, but otherwise it's good night. I should be able to hit refresh, and sure enough, it says good night. I'm going to change that back so that's not so weird. Okay, with that concept, we are primed to now jump back into props and to see what the syntax of props actually looks like.
Okay, let's leave it there. So that was props introduced, basically. Props, short for properties. Props allow you to stuff any kind of information into a component as opposed to having it hard coded. And the other takeaway is you can just dump regular JavaScript logic within a component and reference the results of that logic in variables and then just call them in the return, whatever the component returns via just calling variables, etc. And that's what makes them dynamic. So I'm kind of getting why you'd use React now. I am hungry and it's time for a cup of tea. So I'll see you on the next video, which will be props part 3 and props part 4, where I'm creating a contact component, receiving props within a component. So yeah, stay tuned for the next exercise.